As a concerned mother and father saw their daughter returning from school, their hearts stopped at the devastating sight before them. Their little girl was walking home from the bus wearing only a diaper, trembling with shame and fear. The father immediately rushed outside, wrapping his daughter in a protective embrace as she sobbed, desperate to understand what had happened. When the girl revealed the truth about her teacher and the other terrible things he had done to her, the father's world crumbled, and her words sent shivers down his spine. But the teacher had no idea who the little girl's father actually was. Soon, he would be begging for mercy and regretting his actions bitterly. Before we dive in, let us know where you're watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The morning sun filtered through the kitchen curtains as David Carter sat at the dining table with his wife, Ava. At 40 years old, David had the weathered look of a man who had seen his fair share of life's challenges. As they sipped their coffee and discussed the day ahead, the sound of footsteps on the stairs caught their attention. Their daughter, Mia, shuffled into the kitchen, still clad in her pajamas. Her eyes were heavy with sleep, and her normally bouncy curls hung limp around her face. David and Ava exchanged a concerned glance as Mia slumped into a chair at the table. "Sweetheart," Ava began gently, "you do remember it's a school day, right? Not the weekend?" Mia nodded glumly but made no move to get up. David set down his coffee mug. "Come on, kiddo, you need to get ready for school. Go on up and change. We are almost late." Instead of complying, Mia looked up at her parents with pleading eyes. "I don't want to go to school today," she said in a small voice. "I don't feel good." Ava immediately rose from her chair and approached her daughter. With practiced ease, she felt Mia's forehead, cheeks, and the back of her neck. Her eyes scanned Mia's skin, looking for any signs of illness. "You don't have a fever, sweetie," Ava said, her brow furrowed in concern, "and your skin looks fine." "But I don't feel good," Mia insisted, her voice taking on a whining quality. "My skin hurts when you touch it." As Mia spoke, her eyes darted to the side and she glanced down at her lap. David recognized the telltale signs of a lie. He'd seen enough of them in his line of work to spot them easily, even in his own daughter. With a sigh, David stood and approached Mia and Ava. He crouched down to Mia's eye level, his voice firm but not unkind. "Mia, do you remember what we talked about? What's the consequence for lying?" Mia's shoulders slumped further. "No screen time for a whole week," she mumbled. Ava placed a hand on David's shoulder. "Let's not jump to conclusions," she said softly. "It's still morning and she might just be tired. Remember how late you two were up last night with that math homework?" David nodded, recalling the frustration on Mia's face as they'd worked through problem after problem. Ava continued, addressing Mia. "How about we get you to bed earlier tonight? Or maybe you could take a nap after school if you're still feeling tired." Mia hesitated, then said in a barely audible voice, "That's not why." David raised an eyebrow. "No. Are you sure it's not because you're tired from our study session? You have math class today, don't you? Do you remember what we went over last night?" Mia fidgeted in her seat, clearly uncomfortable. David pressed on, his voice gentle but firm. "We know you don't like math, honey, but you can't just call in sick because you don't like a subject. Sometimes we all have to do things we don't enjoy. That's part of growing up." After a long moment, Mia nodded reluctantly. "I'm sorry for lying," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Without another word, she pushed back from the table and trudged upstairs to get ready for school. As Mia's footsteps faded, David and Ava shared a worried look. "You don't think she's being bullied again, do you?" Ava asked, her voice tight with concern. David shook his head. "I don't think so. Remember, those kids who were causing trouble were suspended months ago, and the school's been really proactive with that new whistleblower program on the parent-teacher app. If something was going on, I think Mia would tell us, or other students would have blown it up on the app." Ava nodded, though she didn't look entirely convinced. "You're right, it's just, she hasn't acted like this in a long time, not since last year." "I know," David said, running a hand through his hair, "but I think it really is just the math. We started a new chapter last night. exponents and roots. It's pretty challenging stuff for her grade, and Mia was really struggling to grasp the concepts. As they discussed the situation, both parents tried to push away the nagging feeling that there might be more to Mia's reluctance than just difficult schoolwork. But for now, they had to focus on getting their daughter ready for the day ahead. 10 minutes passed, and the house remained eerily quiet. David glanced at the clock on the wall, then back at Ava. With a nod of understanding, Ava headed upstairs to check on Mia, while David returned to the dining table to finish his breakfast. As Ava entered Mia's room, she found her daughter dressed for school, but sitting on the edge of her bed, staring at something in her lap. Upon closer inspection, Ava realized it was one of Mia's diapers. "Mia, sweetheart," Ava said gently, "why aren't you wearing your diaper? You know you need to." Mia looked up, her eyes brimming with tears. "Mom, I'm 7 years old," she said, her voice trembling. "None of my friends wear diapers anymore. I don't want to wear them either." Ava's heart ached for her daughter. She sat down on the bed beside Mia, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "I know it's hard, sweetie," she said softly, "but remember, you're not wearing them because of your age, it's because of your medical condition." "So is there something wrong with me?" Mia asked. She took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "You see, your bladder doesn't always send the right signals to your brain, which makes it harder for you to know when you need to use the bathroom. The doctors say you might outgrow it in a few years, but for now, the diapers help keep you comfortable and dry." Mia sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "But why now?" Ava asked, puzzled. "You've never refused to wear them before. What's changed?" "I'm not a baby, and the diaper makes me itchy," Mia insisted, her voice rising slightly. "And I hate how my pants look all bulgy. My friends don't have to deal with this." Ava hugged her daughter close, her mind racing. "I have an idea," she said after a moment. "How about we go shopping after school today? Just you and me. We can look for some slimmer diapers that won't be as noticeable under your clothes. Would that help?" Mia considered this for a moment, then nodded hesitantly. "Okay," Ava said, relief evident in her voice. "For today, though, can you please wear your regular diaper? Just for me." With clear reluctance, Mia finally agreed. Ava helped her daughter finish getting ready, making sure her backpack was packed and her shoes were on. As they headed downstairs, they found David by the front door, already putting on his work shoes. "Come on, kiddo," he called, checking his watch. "We need to get moving." Mia hurried to put on her shoes while Ava quickly packed some toast in a lunchbox. "Eat this in the car," she told Mia, handing her the box. With a quick kiss goodbye for Ava, David and Mia rushed out the door and climbed into the car. As they pulled out of the driveway, Ava watched them go. A mixture of worry and love etched on her face. The drive to school was unusually quiet. Mia focused on eating her breakfast, barely responding to David's attempts at conversation. He tried to review some of the math concepts they'd covered the night before, and while Mia answered his questions correctly, her responses lacked their usual enthusiasm. As they pulled into the school parking lot, David turned to his daughter. "Hey," he said softly, "you don't need to worry about math class today. You're doing great. Just remember what we went over last night, okay?" Mia nodded silently and climbed out of the car. David watched as she walked towards the school entrance, her steps slow and hesitant. He couldn't help but notice how she kept patting the back of her skirt and adjusting her backpack as if trying to hide something. With a sigh, David checked his watch. He had some time before he needed to be at work, and something about Mia's behavior didn't sit right with him. Making a split-second decision, he got out of the car and followed his daughter at a distance. David hung back as Mia entered the school, careful not to draw attention to himself. He watched as she joined the queue at the reception desk to register her attendance, her shoulders hunched and her movements hesitant. As he stood to the side of the entrance, allowing other students to stream past him, a familiar voice caught his attention. "Mr. Carter, Mia's father, right?" David turned to see Mr. Richard Calloway, Mia's new classroom teacher, approaching him with a friendly smile. David nodded, shaking the man's hand. "That's right. Good morning, Mr. Calloway." "I hope everything's all right," Mr. Calloway said, glancing towards where Mia had disappeared into the school. "Dropping Mia off yourself today?" David hesitated for a moment before deciding to voice his concerns. "Actually, I was wondering if you've noticed anything off with Mia lately. Any issues with bullying or strange behavior in class?" Mr. Calloway's brow furrowed in thought. "Nothing out of the ordinary that I've seen," he said after a moment. "Of course, I've only been her teacher for about 3 weeks now, but from what I can tell, she seems to be adjusting well. Is there any problem with Mia that I should be aware, sir?" David shook his head, but not entirely sure himself. "It's just, she seemed really reluctant to come to school today. I thought maybe something had happened." "Ah," Mr. Calloway said, understanding dawning on his face. "You know, it might just be the math. We're getting into some pretty challenging material, and I recently put up a pop quiz. I've noticed a lot of students struggling a bit, not just Mia." "That's what I thought too," David admitted. "We were working on exponents and roots last night, and it was pretty tough going." Mr. Calloway nodded sympathetically. "Have you considered enrolling Mia in the after-school math program? It might help her feel more confident with the material." David shook his head. "I usually teach her at home in the evenings," he explained, "but maybe we should look into it if she keeps struggling." "Well, you're clearly an attentive father," Mr. Calloway said with a smile. "I'm sure Mia appreciates that, but really I wouldn't worry too much. Lots of kids find math challenging, but they're all doing just fine." The school bell rang, and Mr. Calloway excused himself to head to class. David found himself feeling slightly more reassured. He watched as the last few stragglers hurried into the school, their backpacks bouncing against their shoulders as they rushed through the doors. With a deep breath, he turned to head back to his car, but a lingering sense of unease still clung to him. Maybe it was just the math, like Mr. Calloway said, but what if it wasn't? As he returned to his car and settled into the driver's seat, he drummed his fingers on the steering wheel. With one last glance at the school entrance, he decided to set the matter aside for now, reminding himself that Mia was in a safe place now, and there was no need to overthink the morning's incident. David began his transformation from concerned father to undercover narcotics detective. He suited up, slicking wax through his hair and fastening his holster around his waist, taking care to leave his service weapon unloaded. A precaution he always took when coming home, yet one that ensured a quick response if necessary. As he prepared for the day ahead, David's mind shifted from worries about his daughter to thoughts of the dangerous world he was about to re-enter. He was part of a task force dedicated to infiltrating drug distribution networks, and today's mission involved a sting operation at an abandoned warehouse. The drive to the operation site would take several hours, giving David plenty of time to mentally prepare. He thought about the strategies they'd developed to dismantle the cartel, the looming operation deadline, and the ever-present budget constraints. Just as he merged onto the highway, his phone rang. Glancing at the caller ID, he saw it was his boss, Senior Detective Mark Lawson. David answered, putting the call on speaker. "Carter here," he said, keeping his eyes on the road. "David, I'm sorry for the late notice." Mark's voice crackled through the speaker. "There's been a change in shifts. Any chance you could take the night shift instead of days?" David frowned. "What happened?" Mark sighed heavily. "One of our informants has gone missing. We're worried the cartel might be onto us, so we're postponing the morning operation. It's too risky to be near their warehouse right now. Plus, we need more officers for an unexpected night surveillance op at a different location. Looks like we've found a 5th warehouse belonging to the cartel." David considered this for a moment. While the change was unexpected, part of him was relieved. His unease about Mia's behavior still nagged at him, and a night shift would allow him to be home during the day. "Actually, boss, that might work out better for me," David said. "I've got some family stuff going on. A night shift could be good." "I appreciate your flexibility, David," Mark said, relief evident in his voice. "I'll send you the details for tonight's operation. Make sure you read through the material I'm sending about this new warehouse. It's crucial we're all on the same page." After confirming the details and ending the call, David found himself with an unexpectedly free morning. He decided to head home, planning to review the operation materials from the comfort of his home office. As he passed the school again, he briefly considered stopping to check on Mia, but a glance at the clock showed it was only 9:30, still too early for recess. With a sigh, he continued on his way home, hoping that a quiet morning might help settle the nagging worry in the pit of his stomach. The familiar sight of his house came into view as David pulled into the driveway. He couldn't help but feel a sense of relief washing over him, knowing he had some unexpected time at home. As he entered, he was greeted by the surprised face of his wife, Ava. "David," she questioned, a mix of concern and confusion in her voice, "is everything all right? Why aren't you at work?" He explained the situation to her as they moved to the living room, settling onto the couch. "There's been a change in plans. I'm on night shift now, so I've got some time before I need to head out." Ava nodded, processing the information. "Well, I suppose that's not so bad. It'll be nice to have you home for a bit." She paused, studying his face. "How did drop-off go with Mia? Did she seem okay?" David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I'm not sure, to be honest. She was so quiet in the car, and when we got to school, she just seemed off. I actually ran into her new teacher, Mr. Calloway." "Oh." Ava leaned forward, interested. "What did he say?" "He thinks it might just be the math or his new approach with pop quizzes. I know students might not be used to it yet since they're still adjusting to the new teacher's methods," David explained. "Apparently, he said that a lot of kids are struggling with the new material. He suggested we consider enrolling Mia in the after-school math program." Ava frowned slightly. "I'm not sure Mia would like that idea. Couldn't you just keep teaching her at home?" David shook his head. "With more night shifts coming up, I won't be able to teach her as regularly. Maybe you could help her instead." "Of course," Ava agreed readily. "We don't need to waste money on an after-school class she wouldn't enjoy anyway." As they continued to discuss Mia and her struggles with math, David's phone buzzed. It was the promised material from his boss about tonight's operation. "I should probably go upstairs and review this," he said, standing up. "Got to be prepared for tonight." Ava nodded understandingly, and David made his way to his home office. The next few hours passed in a blur of reading, research, and an online team meeting to discuss the night's operation. By the time David finished, his eyes were strained from staring at the computer screen. He closed the window on his computer and headed downstairs, the aroma of lunch wafting up to greet him. As he entered the kitchen, he saw Ava busy preparing their meal, carefully plating their daughter's favorite dish. A glance at the clock on the wall, showing 12:20 p.m., told him Mia should be arriving home any minute now. Once Ava finished setting the table, she turned to David. "I'm going to go change," she said. "I promised Mia we'd go shopping for a new brand of diapers." David nodded, watching as she disappeared down the hall. He hoped the trip would help Mia feel more comfortable. As David made his way to the kitchen, true to his prediction, he caught sight of the school bus through the window. He watched as Mia stepped off, surrounded by the cheerful noise of her classmates. But as the bus pulled away, David's heart dropped. Something was wrong. Mia was walking towards the house, but she wasn't wearing her school skirt. She was in just her diaper. David rushed to the front door, throwing it open and running out to meet his daughter. He reached her halfway down the path, immediately wrapping her in a tight hug. Mia burst into tears, burying her face in his chest. "Mia, sweetheart," David said, his voice shaking slightly. "What happened?" "Where's your skirt?" Mia just cried harder, unable to form words. Ava appeared at the door in her freshly changed dress, her face a mask of shock as she took in the scene before her. She rushed to join them, crouching down next to Mia. "Baby, please tell us what's wrong," Ava pleaded, her voice gentle but urgent. "We promise we won't be mad. We just want to help you. Did something happen at school? Who did this to you?" It took several long moments for Mia to collect herself enough to speak. When she did, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Mr. Calloway took my pants. He said everyone should see that our kind wears diapers." Ava gasped, her hand flying to her mouth in shock. David felt a surge of fury rise within him, his jaw clenching as he struggled to maintain his composure. This is unbelievable," David said, rubbing his eyes and the back of his neck nervously. "I just talked with Mr. Calloway this morning. He didn't seem like the type who would do this." Mia looked up at them, her eyes wide and fearful. "Please," she begged, "I'm not lying. Please don't be mad at me." David hugged his daughter tighter, his voice firm as he repeated, "You sure Mr. Calloway did this? Your new teacher?" Mia nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He said if I told anyone what he's been doing, I'd get punished. That's why I was scared to go to school this morning. I'm sorry I didn't tell you before." David and Ava shared a look of horror and concern over their daughter's head. "We believe you, sweetheart," Ava assured her, her voice thick with emotion. "Every word. You've done nothing wrong." As they stood there on the front lawn holding their trembling daughter, David felt a cold determination settle over him. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. He was going to find out what happened at school and why their daughter had been sent home in such a degrading way. The weight of Mia's revelation hung heavy in the air as David gently guided his family back into the house. Once inside, Ava immediately took charge, pulling Mia into a warm embrace and murmuring soothing words. She led her upstairs to her room, offering comfort as she helped Mia get changed. David, however, was a man on a mission. He followed them upstairs, bounding up the steps 2 at a time, and burst into his office next to Mia's room. With quick, precise movements, he grabbed his wallet, phone, and car keys. His mind raced, a potent mix of rage and protective instinct driving him forward. As he thundered back down the stairs, Ava looked up from where she was tending to Mia on her bed. Her eyes widened as she took in his determined stance and the set of his jaw. "David," she began, her voice cautious, "what are you doing?" "I'm going to the school," he replied, his tone brooking no argument. "I'm going to handle this once and for all." Mia's head snapped up, her eyes wide with fear. "No, Dad," she cried out. "The teacher will punish me tomorrow." David stopped and walked into her room, crouching down in front of his daughter. His expression softened as he met her frightened gaze. "I promise you, sweetheart," he said, his voice low and intense, "that teacher will never be able to hurt you or anyone else again. I'll make sure he won't see tomorrow." As David straightened and turned towards the door, Ava's voice stopped him. "David," she said, her tone urgent, "your holster. You still have your service weapon. You should take it off." David paused, his hand on the bedroom's doorknob. He turned to look at his wife, and the depth of anger in his eyes made her take a step back. Without saying a word, he shook his head no, then strode downstairs, his steps quick and purposeful as he pushed open the front door. Ava followed quickly, catching up to him just as he was about to get into the car. "David, please," she pleaded, grabbing his arm. "Don't do anything stupid. This won't help anyone." But David was already closing the car door, his face set in grim determination. As he sped away, Ava and Mia stood in the driveway watching him go. His heart raced with anger and frustration, not just for what might happen at the school, but for what this could mean for his daughter. As David drove, his knuckles white on the steering wheel, his mind was a whirlwind of dark thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of his daughter, humiliated and scared, forced to ride the school bus home in just her diaper with the other children. The sound of children's laughter from the bus earlier echoed in his ears, and he imagined how mortifying it must have been for his daughter. His thoughts turned to Mr. Calloway's face, the teacher he had spoken to just that morning. How could he have seemed so normal, so concerned about Mia's progress, when all along he had been tormenting her? What else had been happening to his daughter at school? How long had this been going on? As he pulled into the school parking lot, David took a deep breath, trying to calm the rage that threatened to overwhelm him before he stepped out. He glanced down at his holstered weapon, then reached into the glove compartment where he kept the magazine. For a moment, his hand hovered over it, temptation warring with his sense of duty. In the end, professionalism won out. He removed the weapon from his belt and stored it in the gun case in the glove compartment. This wasn't a situation that called for firearms, but that didn't mean he was any less determined to see justice done. With one last steadying breath, David stepped out of the car and strode towards the school entrance, his face set in a mask of grim determination. Whatever happened next, he was ready to face it head-on for Mia's sake, and for the sake of every child who had ever been victimized by those meant to protect them. The school corridors seemed spacious and quiet as David strode purposefully towards the administrative area. The few remaining students and staff members he passed gave him a wide berth, sensing the barely contained fury radiating from him. As he entered the reception area, the secretary looked up and stood to greet him from behind the desk, her welcoming smile faltering as she took in his thunderous expression. "Can I help you, sir?" she asked, her voice wavering slightly. "I'm looking for Mr. Richard Calloway," David said, his tone clipped and cold. "Grade 7 classroom teacher. Where is he?" The receptionist blinked, taken aback by his directness. "Mr. Calloway is teaching an after-school lesson right now. Is there a prob—" "I need to speak with him and the principal," David interrupted. "Immediately." Before the receptionist could respond, a woman in a smart suit walked into the area. Her eyes widened as she took in the scene. "Is everything all right here?" she asked, her gaze flickering between David and the receptionist. David turned to face her, recognizing her as Principal Janet Holloway. Without preamble, he launched into an explanation of the situation, his voice tight with controlled anger as he recounted what Mia had told him. Principal Holloway's face paled as she listened, her expression a mixture of shock and disbelief. "Mr. Carter," she said, her voice strained, "I assure you there must be some explanation for this. Perhaps if we all sit down in my office—" But David was already moving, striding down the corridor towards the classrooms. "No," he said firmly. "I want answers from the teacher now." Principal Holloway hurried after him, her heels clicking on the linoleum floor as she struggled to keep up. "Mr. Carter, please," she pleaded. "We need to approach this calmly. Let's not do anything rash." David ignored her, his eyes fixed on the door to the grade 7 classroom. He knocked loudly, the sound echoing in the empty hallway. When there was no immediate response, he knocked again, harder this time. The door swung open, revealing Mr. Calloway. His friendly smile from that morning was nowhere to be seen as he took in David's furious expression and the anxious principal behind him. "Mr. Carter," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected. Is there something I can help you with? I believe Mia's already gone home." David's eyes narrowed. "Yes, Mia's home, and that's why I'm here," he growled, his voice low and dangerous. "You can explain why my daughter came home wearing nothing but her diaper." Mr. Calloway's face went blank for a moment before he recovered. "I'm sorry, but I have no idea what you're talking about. That's ridiculous," he said, his eyes quickly flicking to the side before returning to the classroom, deliberately avoiding David's gaze. David knew right away that the teacher was hiding the truth. "My daughter doesn't lie," David said, taking a step closer, "and I want answers. Now." Principal Holloway stepped between them, her hands raised in a placating gesture. "Gentlemen, please, let's discuss this in my office. There are students inside watching us." Mr. Calloway's expression hardened. "Yes, there are students inside and I have a class to teach," he said coldly. "If Mr. Carter wants to speak with me, he can wait until I'm finished in an hour." The principal turned to him, her voice firm. "Richard, this is serious. I'm asking you to end your class now and come to my office." But Mr. Calloway wasn't backing down. "With all due respect, Principal Holloway, I won't be disrespected like this. Mia is clearly making up stories and you should be protecting your staff, not entertaining wild accusations. Perhaps you should call security instead." The principal was clearly taken aback by the teacher's directness. As tension mounted in the hallway, David took a deep breath, forcing himself to remain calm. He knew that losing his temper now would only make things worse, for Mia and for him as an officer. But as he looked at Mr. Calloway's defiant face, he couldn't shake the image of his daughter, scared and humiliated. Whatever it took, he was determined to get to the bottom of this, for Mia's sake and for the sake of every child in this school. The tension in the hallway was palpable, as David, Principal Holloway and Mr. Calloway faced off. David could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, but he forced himself to take a deep, steadying breath. When he spoke, his voice was low and controlled. "Mr. Calloway," he began, his eyes never leaving the teacher's face, "when you say my daughter is a liar, are you expecting me to believe that she willingly took off her own skirt, climbed onto the school bus, and allowed herself to be laughed at by the other children?" Mr. Calloway's lips curled into a sneer. "Some children will do anything for attention," he said dismissively. "It wouldn't be the first time a student has shown signs of exhibitionism at an early age." David felt a fresh wave of anger wash over him, but he pushed it down. "And I suppose you also think my daughter is lying when she says you told her that all black people, our kind, wore diapers." Principal Holloway's eyes widened in shock as she turned to Mr. Calloway. "Did you really say that, Mr. Calloway? Speak true," she asked, her voice trembling slightly. At this, Mr. Calloway's composure cracked. He let out a burst of laughter, the sound echoing unnaturally in the quiet hallway. "Oh, that is too funny," he chuckled, wiping at his eyes. "I couldn't have come up with a better joke myself." David's hands clenched into fists at his sides, his knuckles turning white with the effort of restraining himself. "I don't find any of this funny," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. His gaze shifted to the classroom, where the children were beginning to stir, some whispering, some laughing, probably from the joke. If there's one thing this teacher taught, David thought bitterly, it was bullying. Mr. Calloway's laughter died away, but the smirk remained on his face. David took a step closer, his next words measured and deliberate. "You targeted the wrong daughter," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out his badge. "I'm a police officer, and I can assure you this will be settled through official channels." The smirk vanished from Mr. Calloway's face, replaced by a look of shock. Principal Holloway gasped audibly, her eyes widening as she looked between David and the teacher, likely already considering the damage to the school's reputation if the case dragged on with police involvement. Mr. Calloway's demeanor changed instantly. "Officer, I apologize for laughing. It was unethical for me as a teacher," he stammered, his earlier bravado evaporating. "This is all a big misunderstanding. I'm sure we can find a solution together." David's expression remained hard. "Unethical. What you said to my daughter and did to her could be categorized as abuse and racial discrimination." His voice was cold and unyielding. "The first step in finding a solution," he continued, "is for you to show me where you've kept my daughter's skirt." Mr. Calloway's eyes darted nervously between David and the principal. Realizing he was cornered, he swallowed hard. I left it in the staff restroom," he admitted reluctantly. David's jaw clenched. "Lead the way," he ordered. As they moved down the hallway, Principal Holloway, who had been watching the exchange in stunned silence, seemed to shake herself out of her stupor. She turned to a passing teacher. "Call security," she instructed, and call 911. Mr. Calloway balked at this, but David grabbed his arm, propelling him forward. "Move," he growled. They made their way to the staff restroom, the school security guard catching up and trailing behind them. As they entered, David's eyes immediately scanned the room, landing on a familiar piece of fabric hanging from one of the stall doors. "Why is my daughter's skirt in the staff restroom?" David demanded, his voice tight with barely contained rage. "What did you do to her?" Mr. Calloway's face had gone pale, but he attempted to maintain his composure. "Before you jump to the wrong conclusion, you see, Mia, she didn't want to wear her diaper anymore," he began, his voice shaky. "She took it off during recess, before my math lesson, and she had an accident. She wet herself in class. I brought her here to clean up and told her to put her diaper back on." David's eyes narrowed. "And you didn't think to call a nurse or a female staff member to help her, or perhaps give her a change of clothes? There must be extras in the nurse's office." Mr. Calloway's expression hardened. "She disrupted my class," he said, a note of defiance creeping back into his voice. "She needed to learn a lesson." "A lesson?" David repeated incredulously. "She has a medical condition. Your job is to help her, not humiliate her." Principal Holloway, who had been listening with growing horror, spoke up. "Mr. Calloway, we made sure you were informed about Mia's condition when you started. This is completely unacceptable behavior." Feeling cornered, Mr. Calloway's facade finally cracked, his face contorted with anger as he jabbed a finger at David. "Your kind are all the same," he spat. "Criminals who invade this country and take our jobs. Yes, I refuse to give your daughter new clothes. I sent her home in her diaper to teach her parents a lesson about discipline. That's why you people grow up spoiled, always expecting handouts when you can't even control your family. You should be grateful I didn't do more to your daughter." The room fell silent, the weight of Mr. Calloway's words hanging heavy in the air. David's whole body tensed, every instinct screaming at him to lash out. But he held himself in check, his voice low and dangerous when he finally spoke. "You want to talk about discipline?" he said, his eyes boring into Mr. Calloway's. "My years as a police officer will ensure you face the most severe disciplinary consequences for what you've done. First, you lied and hid the truth from an officer. Then you made a racial discriminatory statement and judgment. And third, you treated my daughter in a degrading, borderline abusive way that no child should ever be treated." Something in David's tone must have frightened Mr. Calloway, because in that moment he lashed out. His hand connected with David's face in a resounding slap, followed by a glob of spit. Before anyone could react, Mr. Calloway bolted from the restroom. The security guards standing outside the restroom door, caught off guard by the sudden turn of events, were too slow to stop him. David, recovering quickly from the assault, took off after the fleeing teacher. His police training kicked in as he sprinted down the corridor, gaining ground on Mr. Calloway with every step. Just as the teacher reached for the handle of his classroom door, David launched himself forward, tackling Mr. Calloway to the ground. They grappled on the floor, Mr. Calloway trying desperately to break free while David worked to restrain him. The classroom door burst open, students pouring out to witness the struggle. David managed to get Mr. Calloway into a hold just as the security guards arrived, panting from their run. As the guards took over, securing Mr. Calloway's hands behind his back, the sound of police sirens filled the air. David stood up, straightening his clothes and catching his breath. He looked around at the shocked faces of the students and staff who had gathered to watch the commotion. In that moment, he wasn't just a father defending his daughter. He was a symbol of justice, standing up against those who would abuse their power. As the police officers entered the building, David felt a mix of emotions wash over him. Relief that Mr. Calloway would face consequences for his actions, anger at what his daughter had endured, and a renewed determination to protect not just Mia, but all the students who might fall victim to such abuse. The officers, recognizing David from the undercover team, approached with a mix of confusion and respect. As they began to process the scene, David knew that this was just the beginning. There would be statements to take, reports to file, and a long road ahead in ensuring that nothing like this ever happened again. But for now he allowed himself a moment of grim satisfaction. Justice was being served, and his daughter, all the students, would be safer because of it. As the police officers led Mr. Calloway away in handcuffs, the hallway buzzed with whispered conversations and shocked expressions. David stood to the side, his adrenaline slowly ebbing as he watched the scene unfold. Principal Holloway approached him, her face a mixture of gratitude and concern. "Mr. Carter," she began, her voice low, "I can't begin to express how sorry I am for what's happened. I assure you we'll be conducting a full investigation into Mr. Calloway's conduct." David nodded, his jaw still tight with residual anger. "I appreciate that, Principal Holloway, but I have to ask, how did someone like him slip through your hiring process?" The principal's shoulders sagged slightly. "Our previous teacher left suddenly, and we were already short-staffed. Mr. Calloway's resume looked promising, and we needed a quick replacement. I take full responsibility for not vetting him more thoroughly." David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I understand the pressure you were under, but this can't happen again. These are our children we're talking about." Principal Holloway nodded solemnly. "You're absolutely right. We'll be implementing much stricter background checks and monitoring procedures going forward." As they spoke, David's eyes were drawn to the classroom. The students were still gathered at the door, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. He turned back to the principal. "What about the students? They shouldn't have had to witness this. We'll be providing counseling services for any student who needs it," Principal Holloway assured him, "and we'll be holding a special assembly to address what happened and reassure the children of their safety." David nodded, then gestured towards the classroom. "If you don't mind, I'd like to speak to the students. They deserve some explanation." The principal hesitated for a moment, then agreed. Together they approached the classroom. The students fell silent as David entered, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and curiosity. "Hello, everyone," David began, his voice gentle. "I know you've all seen and heard some pretty scary things today. I want you to know that you're safe now, and what happened wasn't your fault." He paused, looking around at the young faces before him. "Mr. Calloway did some very wrong things, and he's being held responsible for that. But I need you all to understand something important. If a teacher or any adult ever makes you feel uncomfortable or does something that seems wrong, it's okay to speak up. You won't get in trouble for telling the truth." As he spoke, David noticed something on Mr. Calloway's desk. A partially open drawer revealed a small box filled with what looked like lollipops. His police instincts kicked in, and he approached the desk, pulling the drawer open fully. "Principal," David said, his tone grave, "these match the description of laced candy we've been tracking in our recent drug operations. We'll need to get them tested, but if they're what I suspect, they could contain synthetic substances that people have been increasingly using at workplaces to stay alert and focused without drawing attention. Even small amounts can be dangerous, especially to children." Principal Holloway took the lollipop from David's hand, her brow furrowing as she examined it. "I've seen these around," she said, her voice cautious. "I've even rebuked a few staff members for eating them during school hours. I thought it was just a recent trending snack." "Let me tell you, Principal," David said, his tone sharp and serious, "this is currently the most widely distributed substance in the state. The police are working hard to dismantle the operation behind it. And as you can see for yourself, it has even infiltrated the school. Sure, it isn't as high as other substances in its class. It's made with a lower dose, but that doesn't mean it's without side effects or the potential for addiction." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "We need to secure this as evidence, and we need to question all of these students and staff. Find out if Mr. Calloway ever gave them any of these lollipops. I'll make sure my team reaches out to the staff who have already gone home. Until the police deem it safe to do so, the school will have to close." The principal's face paled as she realized the implications. She nodded, quickly moving to call in more of her staff. "Sure, officers. I will gather everyone that is still here at the school. Your team can interview them here in the classroom or use one of our multi-purpose rooms." As the police began to take statements from the students in the corridors, David stood back, his mind reeling. What had started as a horrifying incident of discrimination and abuse had suddenly become much more complex. The connection to his undercover work was impossible to ignore. If they could trace where Mr. Calloway had obtained these substances from, it could give them a valuable lead in their ongoing investigation. He pulled out his phone, knowing he needed to contact Detective Mark Lawson immediately. This development could have significant implications for their ongoing operation. The stakes had just gotten higher. As he waited for Lawson to pick up, David watched the scene unfold around him. Students giving statements, officers collecting evidence, worried parents beginning to arrive. He knew that the fallout from this day would be far-reaching, affecting not just his family, but the entire community. And as he prepared to brief his superior on this unexpected turn of events, David couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of a much larger, more dangerous situation. The worlds of his family life and his undercover work had collided in a way he never could have anticipated, and he knew that navigating the aftermath would require all of his skill and determination. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. David found himself at the center of a whirlwind of police procedures, witness statements, and concerned parents. As he stood in the classroom, overseeing the collection of evidence, Principal Holloway returned with more staffs and approached him once again, her face etched with worry. "Officer Carter," she began, her voice quiet, "the staff members are here. This is everyone we could gather. For those who have already gone home, I can provide you with their contact information." David nodded, his focus sharpening as the principal spoke. He appreciated her cooperation but couldn't afford to waste any more time. "Thank you, Principal Holloway. I'll have my team follow up with the staff who left. For now, let's get the statements from those who are here." He turned to the officers already in the room, gesturing for them to start interviewing the staff and students. His mind was already running through the next steps, the urgency of the situation pressing on him. David turned to her again and asked, "I understand the pressure you are under, Principal Holloway, but one more thing, can you provide us with all of Mr. Calloway's employment records and any information you have on his background?" She nodded quickly. "Of course, I'll have everything sent to the station." "Thank you," David said. As the principal hurried off to gather the requested documents, David turned his attention back to the lollipops found in Mr. Calloway's desk. He carefully photographed the box and its contents, making sure to document every detail. One of the officers who had been questioning the students approached David, a grim expression on his face. "Sir, we've finished talking to the kids. The good news is it doesn't look like any of them actually received one of these lollipops from Mr. Calloway." David let out a small sigh of relief. That's something, at least. What else did they say? The officer consulted his notes. Several students mentioned that Mr. Calloway would often eat the lollipops during class, especially when they were working on paperwork. He also apparently promised that whoever got the highest mark would receive one, but he never actually gave any out. David nodded, his mind racing. It seemed that Mr. Calloway had been using the drugs himself, possibly to cope with the stress of his job or to feed an addiction. But the fact that he had been planning to distribute them to students was deeply troubling. As he mulled over this information, David's phone buzzed. It was a message from Detective Lawson, acknowledging the information David had sent about the lollipops and requesting an immediate meeting back at the station. David turned to the officer beside him. "I need you to finish up here and make sure all of this evidence is properly logged and secured. I have to head back to the station to brief Detective Lawson on how this ties into our ongoing operation." The officer nodded, and David made his way out of the classroom. As he walked through the school corridors, now bustling with anxious parents and curious onlookers, he couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the tip of the iceberg. David stopped at the school exit, his gaze drifting to the board beside the door, which displayed the proud photographs of the teachers and staffs of the school. Mr. Calloway's picture was among them, his warm smile and professional expression starkly contrasting the smugness he'd shown earlier when making those discriminatory comments, or the defiant grin and the unmistakable fear in his eyes as he was escorted by the officer. Now, as he stared at the photograph, David felt a complex mix of anger and pity. He couldn't wait to face the man at the station and have another conversation with him, one that would hopefully reveal the truth behind his actions. David made his way to his car, his mind already shifting gears to the briefing ahead. He knew that the information about the lollipops could potentially shed new light on their undercover operation. As he started the engine, he took a deep breath, steeling himself for the long day ahead. Once he got to his car, David made a quick call to Ava. He explained the situation as briefly as he could, asking her to bring Mia to the station to give her statement. He could hear the mix of relief and concern in his wife's voice as she agreed. As he drove towards the police station, David's thoughts were a whirlwind of concern for his daughter, anger at Mr. Calloway, and determination to see this investigation through to the end. The familiar sight of the police station came into view, and David parked his car, taking a moment to collect himself before heading inside. He knew that the next few hours would be crucial in determining the direction of both the school investigation and the ongoing drug operation. As he walked into the station, the buzz of activity washed over him. Officers and detectives moved purposefully through the corridors, and David could feel the tension in the air. This case had struck a nerve, not just because of the involvement of children, but because it hinted at a larger, more insidious problem within their community. Detective Lawson looked up as David entered, his eyes reflecting a mix of concern and determination. "Carter," he said, gesturing for David to take a seat, "we need to talk about how this school incident ties into our ongoing operation. I have a feeling we've just stumbled onto something much bigger than we initially thought. But before that..." Detective Lawson gazed deep into him. "Carter, I know this is personal for you," he said, his voice low. "Your daughter's involved, and that complicates things. Are you sure you can handle this?" David met his superior's gaze steadily. "I can handle it, sir. In fact, I think it makes me even more determined to see this through. No child should have to go through what Mia did." Lawson nodded, seemingly satisfied. "All right, but if at any point you feel you're too close to this, I need you to tell me. We can't afford any mistakes on this one." "Understood, sir," David replied. He made his way to the station's lobby, where he found Ava and Mia waiting. His daughter's eyes were red-rimmed from crying, but she managed a small smile when she saw him. David crouched down in front of her, his heart aching at the fear and uncertainty he saw in her eyes. "Hey, sweetheart," he said softly. "I know this has been a really tough day, but I promise you, we're going to make sure nothing like this ever happens again. You were so brave to tell us what happened." Mia nodded, her lower lip trembling slightly. Are you going to catch the bad guys, Daddy?" David pulled her into a tight hug. "Yes, sweetie, that's exactly what I'm going to do. And I'm going to need your help. Can you be brave for me a little longer and tell the nice officers everything that happened?" Mia nodded against his chest, and David felt a surge of pride and love for his daughter's resilience. As he watched Ava lead Mia towards one of the interview rooms, David steeled himself for the long road ahead. This case had become more than just an undercover operation or a school incident. It was a fight for the safety of their children, for the integrity of their community, and for justice in the face of corruption and discrimination. With renewed determination, David turned back towards the heart of the police station. He had work to do, leads to follow, and a promise to keep, not just to Mia, but to every child who might be vulnerable to those who would abuse their position of authority and trust.